April 25, 1945. Berlin convulsed under the thunder of Soviet artillery. The ground shook as shells pounded the Tiergarten, tearing centuries-old trees from their roots and smashing stone facades into dust. Smoke hung low over the city, a suffocating blanket pierced by the red glow of fires. In the depths of a cellar near Wilhelmstrasse, a young German auxiliary steadied her breath. The rifle in her hands, a standard-issue Karabiner 98K, felt impossibly heavy. She had been trained with it for barely a week. The officer's words still echoed in her ears. Fight until the last bullet. The fatherland demands it. Above her, the Reichstag loomed like a carcass already half-devoured, its roof punctured by flames. Each explosion rattled the cellar walls, knocking dust from the ceiling and mixing with the acrid scent of gunpowder. She pressed her back against the damp stone, her heart racing faster than the shells that screamed overhead. Around her, other women in gray auxiliary uniforms whispered prayers or sat in silence, faces hollow with exhaustion. They had once been clerks, nurses, telephone operators. Now, they were soldiers in the Volkssturm. In Hitler's final call to arms, every able-bodied man and woman was conscripted. Boys as young as 12 were handed Panzerfausts. Women, dismissed for years by Nazi ideology as unfit for combat, were thrust into the front lines. Some came willingly, clinging to propaganda promises of honor. Others had no choice, forced to defend a city that no longer had a future. Outside, the Red Army advanced with overwhelming force. Marshal Zhukov's artillery alone unleashed more shells on Berlin in a single day than Germany had fired on Paris in 1940. The disparity was merciless. Where the Soviets had tanks, Germany had bicycles strapped with explosives. Where the Soviets had regiments of hardened veterans, Germany had secretaries clutching rifles they could barely reload. Still, in the cellars and ruins, orders were clear. Fight. A nurse-turned combatant tore strips of linen from a wounded comrade's uniform, binding a gash as she muttered through clenched teeth. "Hold him steady. We can't let him bleed out before the Russians arrive." Her hands shook, not only from fear, but from fatigue born of weeks without sleep. Supplies had long run dry. Morphine was a rumor. Bandages recycled until they reeked of decay. On the surface, the streets of Berlin had become labyrinths of rubble. Barricades of overturned trams and collapsed walls turned every intersection into a killing ground. Soviet tanks crawled forward, their tracks grinding over cobblestones slick with rain and ash. German women, stationed alongside old men and boys, crouched behind sandbags, waiting for the order to fire. One auxiliary clutched her rifle so tightly her knuckles went white. A comrade whispered to her, voice trembling, "We will not see tomorrow, but we must hold until tonight." She nodded, though her eyes betrayed the truth. She was terrified. This was not a war of victory. It was survival measured in minutes. Every sound carried menace. The creak of cellar doors, the whistle of falling shells, the guttural shouts of Soviet soldiers closing in. To light a match was to risk drawing sniper fire. To hesitate was to invite death, and yet, amid the ruin, there was defiance. Women hauled crates of ammunition through collapsing tunnels. Others ran messages between units under withering fire, weaving through the ruins of the Unter den Linden. Some stood guard over intersections, rifles shaking, but unwavering. In the flicker of lanterns, a commander barked orders. No surrender. Every street must be defended. Every hand must fight. The irony was bitter. Years earlier, these same women had been told their place was in service, not combat. Now, as the Reich dissolved around them, they were expected to die with rifles in their hands. Berlin was no longer a capital. It was a tomb under construction. Yet within it, women fought to the last, embodying both desperation and courage. As the night fell over the smoldering city, the young auxiliary pressed her ear against the cellar wall, hearing the steady rumble of Soviet tanks closing in. She knew the odds. She knew the futility. But still, she gripped the rifle tighter. Because in that moment, surrender was not an option. Because in that moment, Berlin's women were soldiers. At the beginning of the war, women in the Reich were framed not as fighters, but as servants of the state. Their role was to sustain, not to fight. Nazi ideology, shaped by years of propaganda, insisted that a woman's duty lay in the home, the hospital, or the factory. Yet, as the war unfolded, these boundaries began to blur. The Red Cross uniform became one of the most familiar sights in occupied Europe. Tens of thousands of German nurses traveled eastward with the Wehrmacht, tending to soldiers wounded in campaigns across Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. In field hospitals from Smolensk to Stalingrad, they worked through the night under the drone of enemy aircraft, their hands stained with blood, their ears deafened by the constant cries of the maimed. "We will patch them up and send them back," one nurse wrote in her diary, a line that captured both her exhaustion and the relentless machinery of war she was trapped within. Back home, factories hummed with the labor of women workers. The clatter of presses and the hiss of molten steel filled vast production halls where women forged bullets, assembled rifles, and stitched uniforms. By 1943, women made up nearly half the workforce in munitions production, their sweat feeding the German war machine. Posters plastered across Berlin hailed them as Helden der Heimat, heroes of the homeland, their smiling faces paired with slogans promising victory through sacrifice. Yet behind the veneer of loyalty, cracks appeared. Letters intercepted by censors revealed growing disillusionment. One factory worker confessed to her sister, "The bombs fall closer each night, and still we are told to work harder. I no longer believe in the speeches." As the Eastern Front devoured more and more soldiers, the Reich faced a shortage that propaganda could not conceal. The Luftwaffe turned to women auxiliaries, the Flakhelferinnen, who stood beside anti-aircraft batteries scattered around German cities. In steel helmets too large for their heads, they scanned the night sky for Allied bombers, hands trembling as they adjusted the sights. Sirens wailed, searchlights pierced the clouds, and the roar of engines filled the air. They pulled the triggers that sent bursts of fire streaking into the darkness. Young women defending cities reduced to rubble. By 1944, desperation dictated policy. Training orders extended beyond the auxiliaries. Women were drilled not only in clerical tasks, but in how to operate machine guns, how to administer triage under direct fire, and eventually, how to march under the banner of the Volkssturm. Nazi ideology, which once declared that women had no place in combat, now reversed itself. The same leaders who had derided women as weak now pressed rifles into their hands. Diaries from these years reflect the dissonance. Yesterday I was typing memos in the headquarters. Today, they hand me a uniform and say, I must be ready to fight. I don't know how to hold the rifle without shaking, one young clerk confessed. Others embraced the call, driven by fear of the advancing Red Army, believing propaganda stories of vengeance and atrocities. The transformation was both pragmatic and tragic. The Reich, collapsing under the weight of defeat, forced women into roles it had once forbidden. Nurses patched wounds with no supplies, then carried rifles at night. Factory workers who built shells by day drilled with Volkssturm units by evening. Housewives stood guard at checkpoints, their hands tightening around borrowed pistols. Berlin was not yet under siege, but the seeds of desperation had been sown. The women of the Reich, once celebrated as loyal helpers, were being prepared for something far more harrowing. In the final years, they would become not just sustainers of the war effort, but its last defenders. The contradiction was complete. Ideology had surrendered to necessity, and the women who were once told their place was far from the front would soon find themselves standing at its very heart. By April 1945, Berlin was no longer a city. It was a battlefield. Soviet artillery thundered from the outskirts, turning neighborhoods into smoking ruins. Day and night, the sky glowed red with fires that refused to die. Civilians stumbled through streets littered with rubble, dragging carts stacked with what little remained of their lives. The once proud capital of the Reich had become a labyrinth of barricades and cellars, where survival itself was the only allegiance. Women, who only months before had been clerks, nurses, or factory workers, now shouldered weapons far too heavy for their frames. Volkssturm units, hastily raised from boys and the elderly, included teenage girls in borrowed uniforms. 16, sometimes 17 years old, they were handed Panzerfausts and told by trembling officers, "For the Führer, for the fatherland." Some repeated the words with conviction. Others swallowed their fear, knowing there was no choice but to stand. Testimonies describe the raw chaos of those days. One young auxiliary wrote that she crouched behind a shattered tramcar, her Panzerfaust aimed at a Soviet T-34 rumbling down the street. The roar of its engine drowned her thoughts. She pulled the trigger, the weapon recoiled, and the tank vanished in smoke. When the dust cleared, the tank was still moving, its turret swiveling toward her. She survived only because Soviet infantry stormed past, too focused on the next barricade to notice her trembling form. Meanwhile, hospitals overflowed. In makeshift wards set up in subway tunnels and school basements, nurses bent over the mangled bodies of soldiers and civilians alike. Supplies were almost gone. Bandages were torn from sheets, morphine diluted to stretch a little further. Under sniper fire, women dragged the wounded from craters to the safety of cellars, their white armbands smudged with soot and blood. Above ground, barricades rose out of debris. Furniture, cobblestones, even pianos were piled high at intersections, turning avenues into improvised fortresses. Women and children filled sandbags while artillery shells burst only streets away. The Volkssturm fought with weapons scavenged from warehouses. Rifles from the First World War, captured Soviet submachine guns, and grenades manufactured in desperation only weeks before. In one account, a woman auxiliary carried messages across the city by bicycle, weaving past burning cars and collapsing buildings. At every checkpoint, she faced the possibility of Soviet snipers or German soldiers mistaking her for a deserter. When she delivered the orders, she found the unit she was meant to reach had already been destroyed. She turned back, pedaling into silence, the orders in her satchel now meaningless. Amid the carnage, ideology faltered. Many women did not fight for Hitler or for the fatherland, but simply because their families were trapped behind them. To surrender meant facing an unknown fate at the hands of the advancing Red Army. To resist meant certain death in the ruins of their city. Between these choices, desperation guided their every move. By the final days of April, Soviet tanks rolled deeper into Berlin's heart. For every barricade destroyed, another was raised. For every soldier who fell, another civilian stepped forward, clutching a rifle or a grenade. Women who once bandaged wounds now hurled Molotov cocktails from windows, their faces illuminated by fire. In the darkened streets, echoes of gunfire mingled with the sobs of families hiding below. Berlin had become a city of ghosts, each corner echoing with the paradox of its defenders. Women, once dismissed as unfit for battle, now fought and bled in the streets of the collapsing Reich. The capital was dying, but its people, pressed beyond ideology, beyond fear, clung to survival in the face of impossible odds. The Red Army closed its grip on Berlin with unrelenting fury. By late April, artillery fire thundered day and night, reducing whole neighborhoods to rubble. Apartment blocks collapsed like sandcastles, streets split open under bombardment, and the once familiar city became a cratered wasteland. Soviet T-34 tanks rolled forward, crushing tramrails and barricades alike. Every block became a battlefield, every cellar a fortress, and every survivor a soldier. Whether trained or not, women, once confined to clerical desks or hospital wards, now moved among the ruins carrying rifles, stretchers, or messages under fire. Volkssturm auxiliaries were ordered to hold barricades alongside aging men and teenage boys. Some of them barely knew how to load the weapons they carried. But orders were simple: resist until death. A young woman recalled clutching a carbine that jammed after its first shot, whispering to herself, "Just once more, just one more." Around her, Soviet infantry advanced with practiced precision. Veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk, hardened by years of total war. Inside the cellars and bunkers, nurses fought a different battle. With electricity gone, they amputated shattered limbs by candlelight, their faces glistening with sweat as shells shook the ground above. The smell of smoke mixed with iodine and blood. One diary described how a nurse pressed her hand over a wounded soldier's mouth to muffle his screams. Fearful the sound would draw fire into the makeshift ward. She wrote that in those moments, she no longer thought of victory or ideology, only of preserving the fragile line between life and death. Elsewhere, women crouched over radio sets in damp basements, tapping out signals to command posts that no longer existed. Their transmissions grew fainter as Soviet direction-finding units closed in. One operator sent her final message: "Holding position, no reinforcements." Before the line went dead, the bunker around her collapsing under artillery. On the streets above, Red Army soldiers surged forward with overwhelming force. Years of fighting across the Eastern Front had hardened them to the horrors of urban combat. Mercy was rare. The Geneva Convention's protections, already fragile, meant little in the collapsing Reich. Civilians were swept aside in the chaos. Women in uniform risked being shot on sight, their service as auxiliaries offering no shield against the rage of the victors. Still, defiance persisted. At one barricade near the Spree, an auxiliary stood shoulder to shoulder with Volkssturm fighters, passing grenades down a line while Soviet tanks advanced. When the barricade fell, she was found clutching an empty pistol. Every round fired. Her name vanished into the rubble, but her final act, resistance against impossible odds, became one of countless fragments of Berlin's last stand. Yet courage was not only measured in gunfire. In a basement shelter, a nurse gathered terrified children and whispered songs to drown out the shelling. Another wrote of pulling a wounded stranger onto her back, crawling through burning streets even as tracer rounds cut the air above her. These acts, too, were resistance, not of bullets, but of humanity refusing to be extinguished. By April 28th, Soviet forces pressed deeper into the city center. The Reichstag loomed as their final prize. For German women caught in this maelstrom, survival itself had become a battle. Some continued fighting with rifles and Panzerfausts until overrun. Others held radios until silence swallowed their signals. Many perished unnamed in cellars, their stories buried with them. The paradox was stark. For years, Nazi ideology had dismissed women as incapable of true combat. Now, in the twilight of the Reich, women were not only allowed, but expected to stand against one of the largest armies the world had ever seen. Their resistance could not alter the outcome, but it revealed a bitter truth. In Berlin's ruins, ideology no longer mattered. Only endurance, only courage, and only the will to hold back the red tide for one more hour remained. Berlin's fall was not marked by surrender, but by capture. As Soviet troops advanced block by block, women who had fought, carried messages, or tended the wounded suddenly found themselves prisoners of the Red Army. For some, the moment came in shattered hospitals, their white coats marked with soot and blood. For others, it was at barricades where their rifles clattered from exhausted hands. The transition from fighter to captive happened in an instant. And for many, the ordeal was only beginning. Testimonies tell of auxiliaries and Volkssturm girls lined up in courtyards, their faces streaked with ash. Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of devastation across their homeland, met them with suspicion and fury. Some women were accused of being SS collaborators, regardless of whether they had ever held rank. Interrogations were brutal, echoing with shouts in Russian and German. Others were spared harsher treatment only because of their medical skills. A nurse recalled being ordered to tend to wounded Soviet infantry. They handed me a bandage roll. My hands shook, but I worked. It was the only reason they let me live. For many, captivity meant humiliation. Stripped of their uniforms, they marched east toward improvised holding camps. Columns of prisoners trudged past Soviet supply trucks laden with bread, meat, and crates of ammunition. Diaries reveal the bitter irony. Women who had patched wounds with rags and fed soldiers, potato peels now stared at abundance. Food and medicine they had never seen in such quantities. One auxiliary whispered to a companion, "They have everything. We had nothing. How could we have won?" Some were sent deeper into the Soviet Union, transported in cattle cars toward labor camps. In forests and fields far from Berlin, they shoveled snow, hauled timber, and worked in factories under guard. Survival became a battle of endurance. Letters smuggled out tell of women stealing scraps of bread for one another, hiding frost-bitten hands under shared blankets, or reciting prayers in whispers after lights out. Small acts of defiance, refusing to bow to guards, secretly humming German lullabies, became their final weapons. Others remained in Berlin, caught in the ruins under Soviet control. Nurses were pressed into service in makeshift Soviet field hospitals, treating both German and Russian wounded. They stitched flesh with trembling hands, often watched closely by armed sentries. To heal under duress was both duty and resistance. Proof that even as captives, they retained a fragment of control over life and death. Not all fates were alike. Some endured weeks of interrogations, accused of espionage or sabotage. In Frame-like prison cells set up in occupied Berlin, women tapped coded messages through walls to comfort each other. Others never returned, their names lost in the tide of war. Yet resilience echoed through survivor accounts. One diary described a moment when a group of young auxiliaries, huddled in a barn under guard, shared a single crust of bread. They passed it piece by piece, each taking only a fragment, each insisting another needed it more. In that quiet act, they found dignity where none was offered. For these women, survival itself became defiance. They had entered the war as helpers, typists, nurses, clerks, dismissed by ideology as too weak for battle. By its end, they had carried rifles, tended wounds under shell fire, and endured captivity at the hands of the enemy. Their endurance was not celebrated in parades or medals, but in every whispered prayer, every hidden song, every patient bandaged by candlelight, they fought a final invisible war, to remain human when the world had collapsed around them. The guns fell silent on May 8, 1945, but for the women who had fought in Berlin, the silence that followed was heavier than artillery. Across a shattered Germany, auxiliaries, Volkssturm girls, and nurses emerged from cellars and camps to face a new kind of battle. One not against the Soviets, but against memory itself. In both East and West, their service was rarely honored. Unlike male veterans, they returned with no uniforms, no parades, no pensions. Instead, many carried stigma. In villages and cities, whispers followed them. She must have been fanatical. She carried a rifle for Hitler. To admit participation was to risk being branded a collaborator, even if their service had been coerced or driven by survival. Diaries reveal the dissonance. One young auxiliary described hiding her Volkssturm armband at the bottom of a drawer, never showing it again. Another wrote of nightmares where she still fired a Panzerfaust at Soviet tanks, only to wake and find herself stitching wounds in a rural hospital. Their courage, once demanded by the Reich, was now a source of shame. Yet not all traces vanished. In hospitals rebuilt from rubble, women who had once performed amputations by candlelight returned to medicine with new determination. They fought for better hygiene, more organization, and lessons learned from the chaos of the last months. Quietly, their wartime experiences shaped the peacetime systems of post-war Germany. But publicly, the paradox endured. The East German state celebrated women as laborers and mothers of socialism, while the West embraced an image of domesticity and recovery. Neither side had room for the memory of women with rifles in the rubble. Their stories were buried under layers of propaganda and reconstruction, and yet, in private, their voices endured. Letters tucked into boxes, testimonies whispered decades later, fragments of oral history kept the truth alive. One former radio operator confessed in the 1970s, "We were not heroines nor criminals. We were girls told to fight an impossible war." The legacy of these women was written not in medals or monuments, but in silence. Their endurance became invisible, erased by a society eager to forget the desperation of 1945. But their diaries remind us. Beneath the ashes of Berlin were women who had carried rifles, stitched wounds, and held their ground against impossible odds. The war in Berlin ended not with banners or fanfare, but with silence. Amid the smoking ruins of the Reichstag and the broken stones of Unter den Linden, the last defenders emerged gaunt and hollow-eyed. Among them were women who had never been meant to fight, auxiliaries, clerks, nurses, and girls who only weeks before had held pens or scalpels, not rifles. Yet, in the final days, they had stood with weapons in trembling hands, compelled by orders, desperation, or the need to protect those they loved. Their stories lived not in official histories, but in fragments. A diary entry scribbled in pencil. "I am 17. They gave me a Panzerfaust. I have no choice." A blurred photograph of a young auxiliary standing near a barricade, her uniform torn, her face shadowed by exhaustion. A letter written in the ruins. "We fought for our lives, not for victory." These echoes remain as fragile reminders of women's endurance in a war that erased them. The paradox was cruel. Nazi ideology had long dismissed women as unfit for combat, reserving them for roles of service, motherhood, and loyalty. Yet in the Reich's collapse, those same women were thrust into the line of fire. They stitched wounds in cellars, carried ammunition through shattered streets, and sometimes stood shoulder to shoulder with Volkssturm boys against Soviet tanks. Their fight was not recognized as heroism, it was branded as fanaticism, then buried in silence. And yet, their endurance was undeniable. Some fought because they believed, others because they feared, and many simply because survival demanded it. The rubble of Berlin bore witness to their resilience. Amid the collapse of ideology and empire, they clung to fragments of humanity, binding a wound, sharing bread, offering a final word of comfort to the dying. The final image is haunting. A young auxiliary stands amid the ruins of the Reichstag, rifle lowered, her eyes fixed not on victory, but on emptiness. Around her, silence. The kind of silence that follows catastrophe. In that silence lies the legacy of Berlin's forgotten women. They were not celebrated veterans, nor remembered martyrs. Their memorial is the city itself. The cracked stones, the scarred walls, the whispers of diaries hidden in drawers for decades. Their war was not one of triumph, but of endurance. They remind us that history is not only written in victories and defeats, but also in survival against impossible odds. Forgotten by official memory, their presence lingers in echoes. Faint, fragile, but unforgettable.